that encourage racial segregation through selective breeding so that specific races do not survive. This shows that both the racist communities had found power in uniting their ideals to collectively take racism within their countries on a very applicable level. More details will be discussed in the next chapter on the KKK as well as other openly racist organizations. The sector of education also had segregated black and white schools. 5-year-old Sarah Roberts, who had to walk past several white segregated schools to reach a colored one, had made her father Benjamin Roberts put up a case in court. It was in 1849 when Charles Sumner, future Senator of America, fought for Roberts' case vehemently but failed as the court decided to keep with their ways. Although modern days do not consist of segregated schools anymore, racism still rampantly exists and the policies have reformed to become more ambiguous. In 2017, 15-year-old black girls were given numerous detentions for wearing their natural hair in braids. In fact, in 2019, public schools in America showed images of young black children's hairstyles to show the children in class that those hairstyles were inappropriate. Not only that, but head wraps and scarves are still not considered appropriate according to some American school policies. In France, Muslim girls are discriminated against to an extent that it restrains them from finishing school due to their biased dress code policies. When an overall racist environment exists within a system that many different children grow up in, it can impact them very negatively. Black children have a harder time completing their education compared to white people due to the troubles that they have to face with direct racism. Coming towards the healthcare system, the black doctors and nurses were treated as poorly as black patients. During the 1918 flu pandemic, the black medical staff was not given permission to work in white hospitals. The black patients, however, had it worse as they were more likely to die from the sickness when hospitals were not willing to take care of them. As the death count continued to rise, black nurses and doctors offered their services to their own community. The southern part of America did not even bother to take black people in while in the north. They were delaying the process of helping them as the burden on their medical sector increased due to their epidemic. The black people had increased sense of community as they helped each other out during the difficult times. However, the black nurses were not the only ones caring for their own community. They were called in after the white nurses were sent on World War I. The black doctors and nurses took the burden of the whole nation and served every individual regardless of their race. However, after the war, things got back to how they were. Nothing changed in the overall system. During recent years, not much has changed other than explicit policies. The victims of the system still remain people of color, especially the black people. Health insurances, medical services are still unequally distributed and it impacts black Americans more. Cancer, heart diseases, diabetes, maternal and infant mortality, mental health problems have a greater chance of damaging black individuals than white people in America. Not only this, but healthcare providers are also more scarce in areas in which black communities live. Geographically located healthcare systems were lacking in resources and major disciplines such as mental health, primary care, as well as dental health. This is why many black individuals had a lower life expectancy and had issues with mental health. And one might think the medical sector might have been keeping note of these disparities and perhaps would be working on fixing them. Alas, that does not happen at all. On the contrary, healthcare professionals reinforce false stereotypes and further marginalize minorities. Proof of that can be found in a survey conducted in 2016, in which medical students were asked if black people had a stronger resilience towards physical pain than white people, and 73% of them held beliefs that black and white people had some sort of biological differences between them. Like the institutions mentioned earlier, the organizations that work under the government or private owners share similarities with one another in terms of their racist preferences and policies as well. Just like in schools, natural hairstyles are also problematic to the non-black employers. They often deem their employees as unruly and unkempt with their braided and afro hair. Most of the time, when they are discriminated against for their hair, and if one chooses to file a case on it, then the court often dismisses it. Moreover, there also exists such a thing as black or white sounding names. White sounding names such as Laura Baker or Thomas Fletcher are preferred over black sounding ones like Omar Jones or Likasha Washington in resume selection. White sounding names are more likely to receive a call for an interview. Furthermore, statistically speaking, black individuals have a higher unemployment rate compared to whites. Black women often end up getting bad jobs in desperation as they have loads of financial burdens upon them. Opportunities to jobs is lesser for black employees compared to whites. And finally, unstable jobs with poor pay and fewer benefits is often given to black workers. Statistics show a very bleak situation faced by black workforces. Interpersonal racism. This form of racism exists between individuals and the interactions between them. When people partake in racist activities at this level, they eventually create the same atmosphere within their workplaces, and that is how racism reaches the level of institutions. The ethical dilemma of discrimination may exist within individuals at a conscious and unconscious level. These day-to-day interaction of people indicate people's values and their attitudes towards one another, even if they belong to communities that they do not belong to. Some people struggle with feeling accepted within hostile environments, whereas some may not even experience this at all. The degree of discrimination also depends on the location, and if communities are mixed and racially diverse, then the chances are that they will be treated better compared to other communities. Geographically, as black and Hispanic people are located in specific areas where there are more mixed people and fewer white people, then they will not be discriminated against as often. Whereas within white neighborhoods, minorities are discriminated harshly. Black Canadians, 49% of them exactly, state that they faced challenges that other people would not typically be faced due to racial differences. 41% of them alarmingly state that they did not even feel welcomed within school premises. This is a very worrying thing, as children within schools should always have room to grow and prosper, and that can only happen if they feel safe, accepted, and loved. This also proves that racism exists at a micro level, and the interactions that teachers and children have with one another impact the mental well-being of minorities. Interpersonal racism is not limited to a small social bubble. This will be explained. With the current view of the pandemic, due to COVID-19 still being on the rise, Asians are being treated very poorly, not just in one country, but all around the world. Racial slurs, hate crimes, physical assaults, and hostility is on the rise. The world, being a closely knit collection of societies, has the ability to directly interact with one another, and the level of interpersonal racism expands greatly to the global scale. Other examples of interpersonal racism include threatening and harassment, discrimination within safe places such as work, and social distancing along stigmatization of a certain group of people. Internalized racism. We finally come to systematic racism's smallest level of the hierarchy, internalized racism. This, as you can tell by the name, is the internalization of negative stereotypes and discriminatory beliefs within individuals. The privileged community is sure to have internalized racism, but that does not leave behind the lesser privileged communities, even if they are subjected to racism themselves. The reason for that is mentioned briefly within the previous chapter, and that is because of system justification theory. The result of that is that minorities support the unfair system, as it makes sense to them for how it functions. They start believing that they deserve the unfair treatment and allow the harmful mindset to penetrate into the little ones that are newly subjected to discrimination. The cycle does not break till acknowledgement of racism is attained. And although it is a difficult process at first when it happens, the world morphs into some place different and things can begin to be seen differently. Most white people who also deny the existence of racism do not come from a place of oppression. Rather, it is a privilege, most commonly known as white privilege. The reason for that is simply because they are not impacted by the inequalities, unjust institutions, and hostility. They refuse to not only be within the problematic system, but also of being contributors to it as well. They even go as far as to claim reverse racism, propaganda that only damages the efforts made by people fighting against racism. The impacts. The system that currently exists within the world harbors racism of all forms. In many different countries, the minorities are subjected to open segregation and discrimination. Discrimination is not limited to what black communities are facing in Europe, America, and other predominantly white countries, but each country has its own problem with how they treat its minorities. Even if they are not racially different, ethnical, religious, class, caste, sect can all be strong contributors to discrimination. In recent years, awareness has grown to tackle all forms of racism so that its roots are extracted and eventually the society is cleared with the pandemic of racism from the ground up. In the next chapter, we'll be discussing how racism takes place subtly in different areas of life. Scientific racism. Introduction to scientific racism. Science is kept as a neutral field that should not be influenced by opinions of what society deems as morally good or bad. Nor should it take the approach to solve complex problems with irrationality and bias. It has always been a field of neutral value. All the observations, hypotheses, experimentations, analysis, theories, and laws do not contain any level of subjectivity. Rather, it is kept objective. But role does science have on racism, and how much does it have an impact on society? The truth to the value of science. Theoretically, science should be morally neutral, but that had not been happening due to the strong prejudice seeping into the works of racist scientists. White scientists had devised pseudoscientific ways to categorize black, aboriginal, non-white races as inferior races to the whites. They introduced stereotypes with biased theories supporting them. The topic of race became abundant in science as many scientists were not only trying to categorize humans into different races, but also wanted to rate them according to superiority. As discussed in Chapter 1, many methods were introduced to differentiate different races, but none of them had a concrete reason for identification. Similarly, the concept of humans having a superior race had no scientific proof. For science to be of true neutral value, two conditions are needed to be met. One is that judgments are to be based on cognitive values, and the second is that no goal can be proposed, however methods to attain specific goals can be formulated. For the conditions mentioned, if either of them infiltrates scientific literature, then it is considered bad science. Scientists are humans, and ultimately emotions, prejudices come into play. Science changed as the values became sometimes immoral, skewed, and disastrous too, not only to the entire community of science, but also to various societies of the world. Veiled racism in the name of science. Science has been trusted by almost all the people around the world, so much so that even governments give funds to their indigenous scientific community. This is all for the sake of advancement and technological development. However, there was a time when privileged white scientists researched racial superiority in terms of intellect and physical abilities. Since people had so much confidence in the world of scientists, no one thought to even question what they claimed after their research studies. New, more dangerous forms of racism surfaced: eugenics and scientific racism. These were not direct in application, but they shaped society to become more intolerant and unaware. Scientific racism and eugenics. Scientific racism is the justification of racial inequality through the scientific method. It started the first time when segregation of different human races was suggested. Arguably, Hippocrates can be the first one to do so, as he documented different kinds of humans from all across the world with different traits. In the modern world, the same idea was supported by Carl Linnaeus in 1735, and in the years that followed after, several anthropologists and sociologists contributed to the same idea. Refer to Chapter 1 for more information on different scientists' works. Eugenics had also been around the time scientific racism was introduced. The first person to intellectualize this concept was Plato, but a formal name was not given to it yet. In his works, Republic, he wrote about a society in the future that would become perfect with selective breeding. The members of the upper class would exclusively intermarry while discouraging marriage between the lower class people. The name eugenics was coined by Francis Galton, who was also the cousin of Charles Darwin. He vehemently supported Darwin's theory, and he worked on creating a new concept that would help him in intermarriage between different members of the society. He created a system that would ensure selective breeding between specific classes and social status holders so that preferred privileges were retained by their offsprings. This work also inspired Adolf Hitler and was even referred in his book Mein Kampf. Different organizations quickly started to form, and the world's first International Eugenics Congress was held in the United Kingdom, while the next one was followed up in the United States. Role of science in eugenics. Although science goes hand in hand with the concept of eugenics, as some scientists had always wanted to side with the opportunities to find better humans of the future. Major things that are going to be mentioned are human experiments, social policies, and various other science fields. They are mentioned below. Eugenics in human experimentations. For biomedical and sociological reasons, several experiments were held on humans who either were unaware of the situation they were in or were exploited. The subjects were sometimes children from orphanages or mentally unstable adults, and both parties obviously could not give consent to the experimentations conducted on them. In America and Canada, experiments were done on Aboriginal people. Yellow fever was a forced experimentation project in America on unwilling, captured soldiers and prisoners from Mexico and black slaves from Southern America. In Germany, Nazis were following right behind with their own set of twisted experiments. Countless vile experiments were done openly on Jews who were kept inside concentration camps. The venereal disease was exposed to prostitutes who had reduced rights, as patients in mental asylums were treated as they had life unworthy and hence justified being used for human experiments. And in France, an example of such cruel behavior was displayed when instruments such as galvanic electropunctures were put on freshly dead prisoners who had been executed. Eugenics and social policies. Eugenics aimed to change social policies, and it did. From sterilization laws to ugly laws, the government would impose the policies on their people in accordance with their eugenic ideals and preferences. To name just a few countries: America, China, Chile, Brazil, Ireland, Bolivia, Haiti, Japan, Korea, Kenya, Mexico, Philippines, Spain, Cuba, Argentina, Puerto Rico, Uruguay, Italy, Greece, Germany, and India, all of them and more, had imposed some form of eugenic ideals on their societies. The local population struggled with their racial identities and their socio-economic conditions. Some were preferred over others without a clear reason for it. So much so that laws would allow the authorities to fine or physically punish the lesser preferred members of the society. The idea of pure and proper breeds of humans manifested themselves into actual policies and changed the societal structures. Eugenics in genetics, psychology, sociology, and technology. Eugenics was studied by scientists in different fields, all for the sake of finding perfect human societies. In genetics, studies were conducted to find the hereditary diseases in offspring and how bad genes could be avoided through selective breeding. However, in psychology, mental retardation and various other psychological illnesses were studied so that the mentally challenged people could easily be classified and cornered into a small space in society. Sociology included the study of impure and crude behaviors enacted by some members of society and how to diminish those. Technology is where it gets interesting, as this is fairly new. Prenatal checking is a good example of that. This allows the parents to check up on the fetus and the embryo in the womb for major disabilities. Oftentimes, parents abort the fetus when they find out it to be disabled. Genetic engineering allows modification to be done on genes and, of course, human genes too. The act of doing this may be restrained right now in the world, but the fact that a way is already created for genes to be checked up and marked off shows the willingness of scientists to be able to create models of humans according to their liking of someone already living in the world. Eugenics movement. In the 1920s, scientists were invested in the idea of eugenics so much that they had created a scientific movement on it. It started in America and spread across Europe rapidly. In America, while scientists were conducting their own research, they were supported by bodies that were interested in the same field of work, such as eugenics research associations, American Associate Advancement of Science, Eugenics Records Office, and the American Eugenics Society. This helped in further spreading the agenda. The wave hit Germany in full swing and allowed heinous crimes to occur, all in the name of science. The most terrible ones occurred in Auschwitz, where living human bodies were deformed and reattached to each other. Bodies were torn apart to see how they would survive in different conditions, and everything was kept hush. In 2014, race-based science was fought by British journalist Nicholas Wade, who wrote in his book, A Troublesome Inherence, Genes, Race, and Human History, that was heavily criticized by everyone, including scientists. Anti-Eugenics Movement. When the world saw the horrors of hate crimes committed by Nazi scientists in Germany, ethics and science were reconsidered and the values of eugenics were harshly questioned. The racist approach to science was visible in the world much clearer. After World War I, eugenics lost its momentum as terrible damage was already done to a small minority. America, which was vehemently a supporter of eugenics during the 1910s, reassessed its stance during the 1930s and even closed down bodies supporting the cause. The resilience of scientific racism in the recent years. Post-war, scientific racism stopped using race as the explicit term in their scientific works. Rather, they started using terms that were more ambiguous. Scientists conducted experiments and concluded with skewed results, and although they claimed that some races faced more problems than others, they did not acknowledge in their work that it occurred because of societal structure and systematic racism. They produced results that showed minorities facing problems but did not explain why and simply glossed over important factors. In the year 2021, you must be asking, why aren't we progressing towards a racism-free future? And more importantly, how are the roots of racism still so strong? Everyone has some sort of preference for races, and that is not entirely only their fault. Even if society alone were to change completely, it wouldn't be possible because racism is in fact reinforced by scientists from the past. Ever since the pandemic hit the globe, Black people have been suffering disproportionately, and this is because of scientific racism that has happened in the past. Due to eugenics and scientific racism, scientists had made up facts about the physical differences between Black individuals and the rest of the world using pseudoscience. They wrote about Black people having a higher pain tolerance, immunity, and resilience. This is a severely flawed idea, but recently scientists from France suggested experimenting newly made vaccines on people in Africa. They argued that this would be the best settlement as they have a societal structure where they are exposed all the time and have no healthcare facilities. This was clearly a repeated gross ethical conduct that occurred before in history. African Americans were exploited in hospitals for experimentations not because of their medical conditions, but because of their race. And this reality of the past has only been revisited by the Black community again. The already grieving have more to grieve about, for they are stuck in a loop of exploitation and ridicule. Even after all this being so painfully obvious, it is still not widely acknowledged by the privileged majority for the excuses that they make. The truthful statistics include the sterilization of Black slave minorities in the southern part of America. During the 1920s, when laws were passed to sterilize undesirable members of the society, those of which were mostly racial or ethnic minorities, lower class, and mentally ill people. Throughout the 1920s till the 1970s, Southern Black women were sterilized without their permission. It is estimated that they were 65,000 people in 30 states, but of course, the number must have been much higher than the recorded one. This sterilization program lasted 4 terribly lengthy decades, and although an apology and compensation were offered, it was much too late, for the damage that it caused was exponential. Although modern science negates all the pseudoscientific claims and methodology that was done by the previous scientists, scientific racism and its horrific impacts still exist and actively damages the underprivileged communities. Economy and racism. Introduction. Racism plays a huge role in the economic aspect. Discrimination in the whole economic structure is what many countries are dealing with, where there is a lot of ethnic and racial diversity. Economic inequality not only weakens the overall infrastructure of the country, but also deeply impacts the people with lesser privileges. This chapter will visit how some countries have accommodated their minorities. Economic structure in America. Since there are a lot of minorities in America, we can discuss what impacts economic disparity has on their overall well-being. The Native American community. The land on which United States was built was the result of one of the largest ever ethnic cleansing done in history. When the European settlers came to the lands of the natives, they found it overwhelmingly out of their authoritative control, as most of the lands were already marked by the native tribes residing on American soil. By 1830, Indian Removal Act was explicitly acted upon, and a massacre of millions of natives was enforced. A few years later, in 1887, due to the Dawes Act, the lands were snatched away from the tribes by the federal government. In recent years, only a small fraction remains of people who identify themselves as the Alaska Natives or American Indians. A total of 566 tribal entities are federally recognized in America. A lot of the natives who survived fled to safer cities, leaving their sacred lands behind. Resultantly, they became scattered and scarce in population. Of course, as one might expect, economic stability was not guaranteed to Native Americans due to the very fact that they were to be quickly abolished by the government. In recent years, laws to protect sacred lands and native tribes were introduced. However, this did not guarantee stability. Data extracted by the National Community Reinvestment Coalition showed that in 2018, Native Americans had the lowest socio-economic indicators. They had the lowest percentage of employment and the highest poverty rate. Native Americans have constantly been experiencing huge economic disadvantages ever since the US government took hold and controlled their properties. Till this date, their economic conditions haven't changed for the better. Due to their history of cultural exploitation, identity suppression, forced dispersion, blunt cruelty, and subjugation of sacred lands and voices, they have suffered a lot and have continued to do so in recent times as well. The removal of American Indians from their lands, as well as other deculturation policies, have resulted in the high rates of poverty that characterized this ethnic minority group. One of the most robust scientific findings has been the association of lower socioeconomic status with poor general health and mental health. Another said, "Growing up, I always just thought that white people were healthy and Indian people were drunk and violent." A quote from Native American provider, "The real reason that there are no services is because of racism and discrimination. The state has money, but it never has given any of that money to people that need services. There are no underserved or unserved populations here, just populations that are discriminated against." A quote from BK, "We have extreme stresses on young people who have become fearful. More than distressful, they have become toic. They've become very hard, very cold. They don't like to show emotion. They don't like to show fear. And that translates throughout their entire social life. This means that they are not very successful at negotiating jobs or going down and negotiating loans. They become dysfunctional. Several people with their daily experiences have shown distress in their situation and are aware of them getting the shorter end of the stick with basic rights. When it comes to the US government compensating for their losses, they have devised ways to provide native tribes funds. These funding schemes, however, do not properly reimburse anything, as they are not enough for medical bills, education, and other basic necessities. The reason for that are many. The most obvious one being that the government fails to create a proper Indian infrastructure and pays no attention to the growing needs of the community. Additionally, the funds allocated to the Indian communities are not properly recorded, which is also the sole responsibility of the federal government. The behavior of the government clearly shows no interest in the minority, and the legal rights which were given to the natives were only kept as failed and empty promises. The Black African American community. The history of Black African Americans is similar to the Native Americans, dark, brutal, and filled with bloodshed. Although the timeline and events are different, they still share a lot of similarities between them. Slavery started around the 15th to 16th century. The earliest found record was from 1619, in which a colonist, John Ruffle, talked about his travels around the world on a ship called the White Tiger. Slavery was widespread within America and was thought to be the best method to obtain cheap labor and a workforce. The slaves in America lived pitiful lives. They were tortured, lynched, sexually abused, and even mutilated, all for the benefit of white Americans. They did not have basic human rights and were detained by facilitative services. They were treated poorly not only by the allied classes who commonly hired them, but also the lower class citizens as well. The slaves were controlled and bred only to increase their number for more labor force and to be sold again. Black slave killing occurred regularly as the hate crimes began to rise, but there was nothing to stop the massive wave of racism. The circumstances shifted a little when slavery was abolished for the first time by Abraham Lincoln in 1865. However, things did not change completely. The hate against Black African Americans still remains the same to this day, but it is highly suppressed. Upon freedom, Black families went to bigger cities to look for new opportunities. Others, they found themselves in reminiscent situations where they had to go through explicit discrimination and abuse yet again. They could only afford poor areas to live in and were denied equal opportunities and healthcare services. Some newly freed slaves could not even afford to rent out places, so they sought to work on agricultural lands as farmers to pay the cost of living in the produce they would grow to their owners. This service is referred to as the sharecropping, which often led Black farmers into debt. In recent times, the economic conditions of Black Americans has become somewhat considerably better, although they are still at a disadvantage. Coming right after Native Americans, Black African Americans have the second highest poverty rate in America at 20.8%. Similar is the case with employment. Native Americans are at a rate of 6.6%, while Black African Americans are right adjacent with a rate of 6.5%. Martin Luther King, when he addressed his famous speech, "I Have a Dream," had highlighted important economic views to liberate Black communities from the threshold of injustice. He spoke in the third paragraph about how the American systems are unjust in their economic structures. He urged the government to concern themselves with the case of unemployed Black people so they could come up with new strategies to eradicate poverty with the struggling community. Moreover, he discussed the working of the economy from the perspective of a Black person in his final book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? Martin Luther King said, "We have come a long way in our understanding of human motivation and of the blind operation of our economic system. Now we realize that dislocations in the market operation of our economy and the prevalence of discrimination thrust people into idleness and bind them in constant or frequent unemployment against their will. The poor are less often dismissed from our conscience today by being branded as inferior and incompetent. We also know that no matter how dynamically the economic developments and expands, it does not eliminate all poverty." The Hispanic community. In America, the people of Mexico were always treated as second-class citizens as they were viewed non-white citizens. Due to the stigmatization history of Mexico and its people, the topic of race was highly debated over. Their community would also give ambiguous answers regarding their race as there was uncertainty about their lineage. However, some organizations such as League of United Latin American Citizens, or LULAC, pressed upon the image of the Mexican people as ones who shared white European ancestors just to get treated as equal within the society. They labeled themselves as Latin Americans or Spanish. However, activists from the 1960s embraced their non-whiteness and owned that narrative when the right for equal opportunities was legally passed. However, classification of Mexican was widely based on their economic status. They were considered white when they were from the upper class, while laborers were considered to be of mixed Mexican race. Hispanic immigrants are still treated unfairly depending on how they look as well, regardless of how they identify as. They are more likely to be working with bare minimum wages, with little to no benefits resulting to survive with poor living conditions. Compared to other races such as the whites, blacks, and Asians, they have the highest poverty rate. Household wealth, unemployment, minimum wages, exploitation of labor, poverty, and racial discrimination is what hits the Hispanic community the most. So much so that when a survey was conducted to find out Hispanic people's conditions within the economy, more than half of the total people were hyper aware of their condition. Eradication of racism. The world versus its problems. Racism has its roots embedded within all systems. Sometimes it's harder to identify it, but sometimes it is painfully obvious. Regardless of it being obvious or not, the problem lies within the fact that it is still there, alive and present. Black communities and other people of color face more problems than what was mentioned before in detail. Just like employment, financial conditions, and issues with education, they also get to face issues regarding access to good healthcare, housing schemes, government aid, bank loans, and administration of justice. The whole entire world struggles in controlling their own forms of prejudiced behaviors, with racism being the predominant problem. You might have been thinking that we've come so far along in history and yet we are still struggling with racism. How come it's still that way? Well, an easy answer to that is already hard to completely get rid of racism. Nip it by the bud. But things aren't as simple as they seem. But I sure wish they were. Let me explain this a little more. Starting with how the world currently deals with racism and prejudiced behaviors while focusing on black communities. Starting with predominantly white countries and regions, the black communities suffer from the same problems that other black communities face in different regions of the world. A report from 2017 showed that the statistics of employment within European countries. In Belgium, job applicants with foreign-sounding names were 30% likely to be called for an interview, let alone hired. In France, women of color face a high number of unemployment. However, white women had been catered for the past 25 years. In Malta, informal work as well as domestic work, including house cleaning and laundry, is given to people of color, a lot more than any other race ethnicity there. In Denmark, the situation is somewhat similar to that of Malta, relating to immigrants of people of color. They are overrepresented in the work of services and transportation, all of which can be low income. In Germany, black communities have one of the lowest income at 25% monthly income, which is lower than the national mean. Likewise, in Portugal, black communities are dominating the low-skilled, low-income jobs. They are also highly exploited by their surrounding environment. Many racist incidences which occur tend to be towards black people. In Ireland, the number of discriminatory incidents with black people faced went up 33%. With these European countries, problems such as equal access to good healthcare, housing schemes, education is also lacking. This is because of the institutionalized racism that exists within the systems. Laws regarding immigration, loans, justice, work, and workplace environment caters only towards the white people. Sadly, due to all the oppression and subjection to hate, discrimination can commonly lead to hate crimes as well. Similar in the case with South Africa, employment of black people is lacking as workplaces prefer white people more. Within the education system, underrepresentation can be seen of black teachers and students. Some claim that within education institutes, white academics are promoted. Physical assaults on black people are common as well. All forms of violence against different races are born out of pure hate for one another. Physical, emotional, verbal, and mental abuse breeds more violence, and the circle never ends. The ages of black people that get assaulted are important to note because the young ones, it seems like, are not free from the curse of racism. Adults, teenagers, and even young children get to experience extreme hate and violence. It is commonly assumed that black communities recently settled in Australia. However, it is not the case, as they first settled there in the year 1788. They were 11 in total. And that is where the conversation starts. However, the black communities did not exclusively come from Africa. They came from Jamaica, Brazil, Guyana, and other places as well. This is what the black communities in Australia struggle with, their identities, on top of other problems. They dwindle between the feelings of belonging to longing for the homes that their ancestors left. The color of their skin, however foreign to others, brings them all together and unites them as one. As black Australians, and with that, they are subjected to racial discrimination, violence, and seclusion. Black people are treated very poorly, and many young ones from the community that think that their blackness is a burden upon them. One may think of the population of black people is increased, then racism won't be there anymore. And sadly, that is a wrong assumption. A good example of that is Brazil. Despite having a large population of black people, there is still rampant racism all across the country. It had a troubled past with slavery and legislature which allowed racism to flare up initially. However, during recent years, Brazil was promised to have better systems for black communities to thrive and survive in. Research showed how Brazilians experience life within their own country. 63.7% of Brazilians believe that the quality of life depends on the race. 70% of them identify the racist behavior towards them within workplace environments, police interactions, judgments passed by people, and social relations that they have. Education, employment, and wealth are unevenly distributed still between the races, which are, as I had given examples